Okay, so officially, welcome to our January webinar. The topic that we will be talking about this evening or tonight or this morning, whatever time zone you're in, is perfectionism and its connection to skin picking. This is a topic that you selected last time, so that's what we will be talking about tonight. I realized just now that I didn't activate the poll for next month. I will do that once I finish, before we get to the Q&A part. So my apologies for that. So let's get started. Okay, so these are some of the topics that we will be talking about today. So as always, we will first have to define the topic that we want to talk about. Then we will talk a little bit about psychology of perfectionism, different ways of thinking and seeing the world and participating in the world as a perfectionist. We will talk about how that leads to skin picking, and then we'll discuss some practical ways to handle perfectionism in everyday life. And then, as always, we will get to the Q&A section of the webinar. Just 1 second. Before we proceed, I would like to activate the poll. Just one little moment. Here it is. So once we finish voting, once we finish the webinar, I will see what wins, and that will be our topic for next month. So let's get started and see what exactly we're going to talk about. So what is perfectionism? When I started preparing the presentation, I realized that most of the definitions that I found were really very dry and not particularly informative in any practical sense. So this was the first one that I found, and I decided immediately after that I'm going to need a shift in how I'm going to talk about perfectionism, and here's why. So this is the definition. So the overdependence of self-evaluation on the determined pursuit and achievement of self-imposed, personally demanding standards of performance in at least one salient domain, despite the occurrence of adverse consequences. There's a lot of stuff that's packed into this definition, but I don't think, I will say that a perfectionist probably wrote this definition, and because it contains so much, it's very dense and highly impractical. So once I read this, I thought, really, like every definition I could find in studies and kind of psychology books that I had around were more or less similar to this. So I decided to venture in two different directions. One is stuff that, let's say, we can vaguely define as more pop psychology than anything else. And then other strand, which is more dense, more philosophical, and more psychoanalytical psychology. So I'm going to give you two other approaches to perfectionism so that you can get a fuller, deeper, and more practical picture by combining these kind of unlikely strands of psychology. So the first view of perfectionism that I'm going to tell you about is from an essay called The Tyranny of the Should by Karen Horney. This is the lovely lady on the right side. She was she still is quite a famous psychoanalyst. And I really like her work because it's more accessible than, let's say, some of the traditional psychoanalytic writing. It's very easy, it's humorous, it flows, and it's easy to understand. You can find this essay online if you like her ideas, and then you can read all of it. And of course, the most beautiful thing about her is that she bred Cocker Spaniels, and that's one of her Cocker Spaniels there on the right. So here's a part of the essay. So she says, we have discussed, meaning elsewhere, chiefly how the neurotic tries to actualize his idealized self with regard to the outside world. So another thing I have to say, this is an old essay, so it's almost 100 years old, meaning that the language that she uses is not always up to date. So she refers to this hypothetical neurotic, which is something that we would not say today, and we certainly wouldn't call a theoretical person a he. I didn't change it because that's how she wrote it, so just keep in mind. Okay, so in achievements, in the glory of success or power or triumph, neurotic claims to are concerned with the world outside himself. He tries to assert the exceptional rights to which his uniqueness entitles him whenever and in whatever ways he can. So her idea is that, let's say, a perfectionist has a kind of sometimes unconscious idea that they are somehow unique and exceptional, or at least that they should be unique and exceptional. And then she goes on, says, his feeling entitled to be above necessities and laws allows him to live in a world of fiction, as if he were indeed above them. And whenever he falls palpably short of being his idealized self, his claims enable him to make factors outside himself responsible for such failures. Let's move on, it'll become clear. The neurotic sets to work to mold himself into a supreme being of his own making. He holds before his soul his image of perfection and unconsciously tells himself, forget about the disgraceful creature you actually are. This is how you should be. And to be this idealized self is all that matters. You should be able to endure everything, to understand everything, to like everybody, to be always productive. How does that sound? Her language is very direct and very bold, I feel. So there are two ideas here that I think are very important for us to understand perfectionism. One is that the perfectionist, this kind of hypothetical model of the perfectionist, is someone who feels entitled to be perfect. So this is extremely important. So it's something that the perfectionist feels that it's his right. At the same time, there's this tiny little voice saying that this person indeed is actually a disgraceful creature. It says, forget about the disgraceful creature you actually are. So I feel entitled to be perfect, but I know that I'm not. My idea of perfection is a fantasy. And I feel that it is my right to be that fantasy, and I subdue and kind of subject everything in my life to make this fantasy come true. So there's a little bit of a paradox here if you think about it, because I know that that's not what I am, yet I insist that this is what I must be. So there's always like this essential tension that follows perfectionism. And then the should that comes out of this is you should be able to endure everything, to understand everything, to like everybody, and to always be productive. This last one, to always be productive, really rings true to me. And this is something that working with SkinPick and in general with people who struggle with body-focused repetitive behaviors, this is something that I very frequently encounter. This, I must always be productive. I must always do something productive. Resting is lazy. If I, like, it's very common as a theme. There's another view of perfectionism which uses a language that we understand a little bit better. This is Brené Brown. And so here's a quote from her. Perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to do your best. So there's no such thing as healthy perfectionism. There is striving to do your best, which is fine, and then there's perfectionism on the other side. Perfectionism is not about healthy achievement and growth. Perfectionism is not self-improvement or striving for excellence. And I hope this was also clear in a little bit in the previous quote, which was a little denser than this, more difficult to understand. But perfectionist doesn't try, even in the psychoanalytic vision of perfectionism, the striving is not to become something better or perfect even. The idea is to appear as your fantasy says that you should be, right? And this is why Brené Brown also says perfectionism is not self-improvement or striving for excellence. Perfectionism is the belief that if we live perfect, look perfect, act perfect, we can minimize or avoid the pain of blame, judgment, and shame. It's a shield, rather a mask, in a way. Perfectionism is a 20-ton shield that we'll lug around thinking it will protect us, when in fact, it's the kind of thing that's preventing us from taking flight. I truly enjoy the way that she talks and writes. Her ideas are usually something that we've had previously in psychology, but she really has a wonderful way, I think, of putting them to make them just so clear and easy to understand. And for me, the main theme in this quote here is that it is a belief that if we look perfect and act perfect, that will somehow get us to avoid blame, judgment, and shame. Again, the emphasis is not on actually being anything. The emphasis is on being perceived as something. There's obviously a great difference there. Let's see what else she says. Perfectionism is not self-improvement. Perfectionism is, at its core, about trying to earn approval and acceptance. This is another very common theme that I come across working with clients at SkinPick, which is that a lot of energy is focused on being approved of by your peers or children or parents or partners and so on. So the way that often clients say is that they don't really feel at ease unless someone tells them that they're just fine, they're doing well. Even when they know that they do something well, it's almost like that knowledge itself doesn't really bring the gratification that another person saying that would bring. Most perfectionists were raised being praised for achievement and performance. So grades, manners, rule following, people pleasing, appearance, sports. Somewhere along the way, we adopted this dangerous and debilitating belief system. I am what I accomplish and how well I accomplish it. Please perform perfect. And these three words are, I think, the core. Please perform perfect. Healthy striving is self-focused. Perfectionism is other-focused. So healthy striving would be, what will I think? And perfectionism would be, what will they think? So this is from her book, The Gift of Imperfection, which is a really easy read, and I highly recommend it if you like the way that she writes. This quote is, I think, to a large degree representative of her writing style. So I hope that there are some themes here that have become apparent. One, that there is always this impossible fantasy guiding perfectionism, and that the perfectionist knows always at the bottom that no matter how well they do, deep down they know that they're not what people are validating. And this makes perfectionism by definition unachievable. Because even when people tell you, yes, this is exactly perfect, this is as good as it can possibly be, it feels good, it's an excellent validation to get, but it doesn't change the fact that deep down, there's this tiny little voice saying, yeah, but that's just not good enough, because that's not who you really are. So perfectionism is kind of playing a role that you're trying to convince yourself and others that you're playing. Right? And then there's this other side, which is that perfectionism is essentially about acceptance. And this is why perfectionists do what they do and play the roles that they play and try as hard as they try. And in the end, I think she kind of sums it up very well, which is that when you notice in your behavior that you're being self-focused, that's something to validate, to develop, nurture, cultivate, encourage, and so on. Whereas other focused behaviors are usually what is a kind of a sign, an alarm, if you will, that there's something perfectionistic going on. This is slightly simplified because people are much more complex. And I think at a certain fundamental level, it's really difficult to say what's self-focused, what's other-focused, because we always live in a social world, and sometimes for our own peace of mind, we will do something for others, but that's not necessarily perfectionistic. However, if you build a certain image at work because you want others to approve, instead of you actually being happy with that person, then that's perfectionism, right? If there's anything that's not clear about this, please use the Q&A option, and I will answer all your questions in the end when we get to the Q&A part. But feel free to ask questions along the way. So here are some behaviors that may not be the sort of that may not themselves be perfectionistic, but very frequently, if you see some of these grouped together, it's a pretty good sign that we're dealing with a perfectionist. So one is procrastination. Uh, One thing about perfectionism is that there's always this fear of failure. So the failure kind of looms above everything that a perfectionist does. That means that everything you do is in some way a test of your abilities. So whatever you decide to do for work in private life, depending on where your perfectionism is situated, that's an opportunity for you to fail, right? So procrastination is something that often happens to perfectionists because failing is really difficult. And then you try to avoid failure or anxiety or blame or guilt and so on by procrastinating, because you're essentially postponing what's inevitable in the mind of a perfectionist, which is invalidation. Then comparing yourself to others is also something that's quite frequent. Of course, not only perfectionists will compare themselves to others, but because perfectionists need the approval and the acceptance from their environment, or at least from those significant others, they will often compare themselves to other people to see if they're doing better or equally well. Needless to say, these comparisons will mostly be negative. So a perfectionist is not only likely to compare him or herself with others, they're also likely to do that in a negative way. So it's never going to be, I'm as good as the person X, or I did this better than this and this person. It will always be, look, they can do all this, but I can't. They did it with ease, and it took effort for me, so I must be worse, and so on. Perfectionists are also very likely to seek reassurance from other people. So even when you know that you did something as best as you possibly could have, if you're a perfectionist, you're still likely to want to hear it from others just so that you're absolutely sure. Because other people essentially hold the power to determine your self-image. A perfectionist is also likely to expect validation. Even if you don't seek reassurance or ask for validation, a perfectionist is likely to expect validation from people for certain things that they do. And then when they don't get that validation, they're likely to be very upset, offended, or disappointed in other people. Overachieving, I don't think, requires a lot of explaining in the context of perfectionism. Another thing is that perfectionists will often avoid performance tests or assessments. Every now and then, when I work with students or younger people in general, so someone who's in college or doing their post-grad degree or even in high school, perfectionists are very likely to suddenly become ill before a test, or to sleep in or be late, or do whatever they possibly can to avoid being graded and rated, because then there's a lot of anxiety around these situations because every test is a potential failure. And every time you're supposed to be assessed by someone, that's a chance that you might not get the validation that you need. And in the mind of a perfectionist, as we will see later on when we talk about different ways of thinking in perfectionism, sometimes absence of validation is invalidation. And then, of course, then there's organizing and list making, which sometimes borders with obsessive. And this obviously has to do with overachieving that was mentioned above, and also sort of high expectations that a perfectionist has. Because if you remember the quote from Karen Horney, a perfectionist must do everything, must know everything, must be always productive. So that kind of necessitates, as a consequence, to be extremely well organized. Funny enough, a perfectionist rarely actually feels as organized, because nothing is ever good enough. So hopefully by now you have a good picture of what is it that I'm talking about when I'm talking about perfectionism. So now let's use what we have and then create a bridge to body focused repetitive behaviors, and of course specifically to skin picking, and kind of connect these two together. I will go back to the essay that Karen Horney wrote, the one about the tyranny of shoulds. And I will use her ideas and then tie them into to skin picking. And also, if you attended the previous webinar in December on avoidance, I think this will come naturally to you. So Horney says essentially that these shoulds that perfectionists kind of have to serve and that they live with have a coercive power. Essentially, you fear your shoulds the way someone might fear a dictator. In fact, the title of her essay is The Tyranny of Shoulds, so that kind of flows naturally from there. So the reason why you fear is because there's a lot of guilt, threat, and anxiety, and general sense of worthlessness that comes once you clash with your shoulds. If you're not obedient enough or cooperative enough, your punishment is essentially an incredible amount of anxiety. And so, especially if people have issues tolerating difficult emotions, then what they do is they employ all sorts of mechanisms to avoid or attenuate that anxiety. And this is what Karen Horney says. Reactions of anxiety often escape attention because the customary defenses against anxiety are set instantaneously. So what she says here is that perfectionists sometimes will say, well, I'm not really an anxious person. And this is often because these behaviors to compensate and avoid anxiety instantaneously arise. So the longer you've been a perfectionist, the more perfected are your mechanisms to avoid anxiety. So they're activated immediately. This is one of those things when clients in SkinPick say, well, I had a difficult conversation and I didn't even leave the room and I was already touching my face, for example. So it flows seamlessly to avoid anxiety. So here are some examples that she gives. She says, thus a man who felt he should be a saint-like friend realized that he had been harsh towards a friend when he might have been helpful and went on a heavy drinking spree. Again, a woman who felt that she should always be pleasant and likable was mildly criticized by a friend for not having invited another friend to a party. So something that most people would simply gloss over, for a perfectionist, a minor criticism is essentially a full-on attack. So this woman says, she felt a fleeting anxiety, was for a moment physically close to fainting, and reacted to that with an increased need for affection, which was her way of checking anxiety. So she immediately clung to behaviors that will allow her to avoid the experience of anxiety. And then there's another one, which is so very typical. A man under the duress of unfulfilled shoulds evolved an acute urge to sleep with some woman. Sexuality for him was a means to feel wanted and to reestablish his sunken self-respect. So by reestablishing one's self-respect, anxiety is dissolved. And so these are some examples how other people might react to anxiety that comes from this fear of basically not being good enough according to your fantasy of what perfect is. And for some people, skin picking would be this mechanism. So you may ask, and indeed people often ask me this question, if skin picking is a way to deal with anxiety or other difficult emotions such as guilt and threat and anger, why skin picking? So why is it that some people will become promiscuous, other people will have this increased need for affection? And so some people will go on a heavy drinking spree, as she describes here. And then why is it that some people will pick their skin? And this is a question that, even though I often get, I really don't have a generalized answer to, because this is exactly the point in psychology and in psychotherapy, where we can maybe conduct a study and say, well, people who have this and this are more likely to display certain types of behaviors. But why is it that for you specifically, this became a way to relieve anxiety? This is something that only you can answer by kind of going back to the way that skin picking began. Sometimes it's a learned behavior that was present in some way in the family, and then children kind of absorb everything like sponges, including things that parents don't know that their kids even see. And then if one of your parents, for example, struggled with skin picking, or a cousin, a child easily learns that, well, this is what they do when they're upset, for example, right? And they also learn shame when they see, oh, this is what they do, but they're hiding. So they have no choice, but it's not really good. So this is just a hypothetical example. For example, I've had clients in the past who learned hair pulling, for example, from their parents, where parents would either ask their children to pull their hair or even pick their skin sometimes. And at other times, the person's body was basically the only thing that they could control, or the only thing that in that moment was close or available, right? And in some instances, skin picking might hold additional meaning, and that could be the reason why skin and not something else. So the answer to this specific question, why of all the possible behaviors, skin picking was your answer here, this is something that you can find in your own experience. If you have a therapist, that's something that a therapist can help you with. If you don't, then you can kind of think on your own. But eventually, I do have to say is that this is not something that you necessarily have to know to get better. It's something that I guess contributes to self-knowledge, but isn't necessarily unavoidable when you want to get rid of skin picking. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you a constructivist perspective on skin picking, which is only a constructivist perspective on skin picking. The reason why is because constructivist solutions tend to kind of yield very practical results. So I'm going to sort of give you a crash course in constructivist psychology, and then I'm going to give you examples and show how this applies to perfectionism, and then from there we will go to the practical aspect of things. So for those of you that are listening to me for the first time, this might be new, but for you who have been to my other webinars, you probably already know about George Kelly and constructivism. So according to constructivist psychology, specifically George Kelly's personal construct theory, we structure our experience by using these things called constructs. So essentially, a construct is the way that we extract meaning from what happens to us, right? And then we use these constructs to anticipate what will happen. Kelly used to say that we're all like scientists. So we will form these hypotheses, which are what we call constructs. We will test them, and then we will see if they match our experience or not. And then we will either keep them or change them. And then when we keep them, we have a tool on how to deal with a certain situation. So essentially, constructs give us meanings, and then they tell us how to act. Not all constructs are born equal. There's always a hierarchy. The higher up they go, the more important they are. Those on the very top make up who we are as people, essentially what we might call our identity. Every one of these constructs has two sides. So I imagine them like scales or like a coin or something. So these are some examples, very generic ones, like good, bad, happy, sad, black, white, right? So in order to fully understand what sad is, you really need happiness to contrast it with. And that gives you a fuller picture. And the same goes with our constructs. So there's always two sides. This will be quite important as I proceed to explain other things. So according to constructivism, the trouble with perfectionism is not so much in the content of our constructs. So it's not that we have a construct, hypothetically speaking, good versus bad. It's the way we use that construct. So the meaning itself is not the problem, it's how we apply it and what we use it for. And so we will be talking about these different ways of using constructs and how a specific combination of these ways yields what we may call perfectionism. So this is Kelly's image. There are three important concepts that we will be working with. One is called impermeability. The second one is called preemption. And then the third one is called hostility. Hostility is quite possibly my favorite term in all of constructivist psychology. It's not a simple concept. It includes what we would typically, in everyday life call hostility, but it's much more subtle and I think just brilliant. But then again, I think that for most things that Kelly ever wrote. So these terms are all, let's say, one side, one pole of a construct. So impermeable versus permeable, preemptive versus something we call propositional. So there's always two sides to these things, because Kelly was honest enough to say that, well, my view of psychology is also construct. So let's see what impermeability is. These are some examples from SkinPick. All I'm asking is for my skin to be completely smooth because that's the only way that I can be happy. Is that too much to ask? It's just skin. That's one example of what impermeable constraint is. Here's another. I know, I get it. Too much on my plate. But I can't let my husband do anything because he does it wrong. I have too much on my plate because he doesn't know where the plates go when he washes them. There's really only one place to put them. How hard is it? So to answer your question, yes, only I can do these things. Here's another example. What makes me a bad mother? Well, I don't spend enough time with my kids. We often eat fast food because I'm too tired to cook. I work too much, but I have to work too much because I also have a career. We don't have enough fun time together. I can't tutor them as often. My mother did all that for me. The only way to be a good mother is to do everything that a good mother is supposed to do. So what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about impermeability? If every construct has two poles, when you apply a construct in an impermeable way, one pole accepts only one element, so the favorable side usually, accepts only one element, which means that everything else goes on the opposite side. So only one thing can be good, and everything else, no matter how close to good, it's immediately bad. Like there is no, so unless you meet all the criteria for, let's say, good, it's the same as if you had met none of them. So if you do 7 out of 8, it's the same as 0, unless it's 8 out of 8. So the only way, if we go back here, so the only way to be a good mother is to do everything that a good mother is supposed to do. Not most things, not all things most of the time. So none of this. The only way is to do everything. So in every other instance, my client here is a bad mother, and that's it. And this is impermeable constraint. If this is not clear, I know these terms are new and very strange, and this is, everything but pop psychology. It's very technical. So feel free to ask if there's anything that you don't understand about this. So essentially, just to give you like a very, very general rule of thumb, if there's only one way to do something correctly, that's impermeable. And this is very, very obvious with perfectionism. And it accounts for one characteristic of perfectionism, which is really difficult to grapple with emotionally, which is that perfectionists very easily discount everything that's positive. So impermeable constraint means that not only do you easily discount everything positive, the negative is what you see first. Sometimes when perfectionists talk or when you have a conversation with them, it will seem almost as if they're looking for what's wrong. So to give you an example, I was responding to a client's message earlier today, and the client was trying out certain competing responses, and they did it quite well. But they didn't say, great, I did it very well. They said something like, I was able to reduce my picking by about 90%. That means that every 10th time I completely failed. And then I thought, you had a 90% success rate. That's amazing. I mean, that's really amazing. After only a week of competing responses, that's brilliant. But what my client saw was that every 10th time they failed, which in their eyes was almost as if they had failed every time, because 90% is, guess what? Less than 100. And 99% is also less than 100. So when impermeability sets in, it's almost impossible to actually be happy unless everything is perfect. And the trick with impermeable constructs is that the criteria are defined in such a way that it's almost impossible to really ever achieve them. So that would be impermeability. Let's move on to preemptive constraint. So what is it? I'm going to give an example here. So the man on the right is obviously Dostoevsky, spoiler alert, because there's a title here. So who is Dostoevsky? William Faulkner and most people, I guess, would say that he was one of the greatest novelists of all times. And one of my friends who likes Dostoevsky very much, he says he's the greatest novelist of all times. There are some people who say he's a sloppy, even mediocre Russian writer. One of these people is another great Russian writer, which is Tolstoy. I remember I was reading, I think it's like either a journal entry or something by Tolstoy, and he said something about Dostoevsky along these lines. He said that Dostoevsky is technically a bad writer. And I remember reading this thinking, well, finally someone said it. And if Tolstoy said it, then I can repeat it because otherwise people will call me crazy. But indeed, at least that's my impression from reading Dostoevsky. Sometimes it does seem sloppy. I like very nice, tight, wonderfully kind of arranged prose, like Tolstoy's. So the reason why Tolstoy called him a sloppy writer is because he says his sentences are technically bad. And he also writes things like, in Crime and Punishment, there's one description where he says there was an oval table of the round shape or something like this, right? So that's one view of Dostoevsky, a minority view and yet a view. Then some people might say that he was a great psychologist, and in fact, I've met psychologists who think this of Dostoevsky. The person that I have in mind here when I was writing this is Nietzsche. Nietzsche in Genealogy of Morals, not sure, don't take my word for it, but in one place Nietzsche said that Dostoevsky is the only psychologist who ever had anything to teach him. Nietzsche was a very modest man, as you can see. But yes, so for Nietzsche, for example, Dostoevsky was not a great novelist. He was a sloppy writer. He was a great psychologist. I've heard people say that he was a glorified crime writer because of the Brothers Karamazov and also because of Crime and Punishment. There have been people, great writers indeed, who have called him trash. And I'm not kidding you. One of these was Nabokov, the great Russian-American writer, one of my all-time favorites, who said that his books were trash or garbage, one of these kind words. Nabokov had very strong opinions. He says that they were all trash because of his politics and also because he was only capable of writing about neurotics and crazy people. So these are not my words. This is me quoting Nabokov. Some people like Camus and Sartre said that Dostoevsky is actually the first existentialist, so he's also a philosopher. And then several writers have commented that Dostoevsky is also an ideologue. Incidentally, this comes from very different political positions. Maxim Gorky, the Russian writer, said that Dostoevsky was really a political writer because of the unflattering way that he wrote about the working classes. And Nabokov, who was about as far as you can get from Gorky politically, he says that also the same thing about Dostoevsky, but for different reasons. He said Dostoevsky is obsessed with Russian mysticism, and he tries so hard to say Russian Orthodox Christians are, a continent of their own, and they have nothing to do with this Western European rationalism, which upsets Nabokov because he rightly sees Russian culture as being kind of squarely in the middle of Europe, which even in the case of Dostoevsky is true. So I ask you, who is Dostoevsky? He's all of these things at the same time. There are many constructs that we can extract from this story that I just told. And all of them hold true to a certain extent of Dostoevsky, and all of them represent valid. My apologies. Something happened with Zoom. Let me just share the screen again. Okay, so my question here is, who is Dostoevsky? And then the answer is all of the above. And this is an example of propositional constraint, when we can use several different constructs and apply them to the same person or an event at the same time. I think due to the times that we live in, propositional thinking is not really very popular. Like if you try to think propositionally about politics, whatever side you mention, they will likely hate you because we live in a world when politics is so polarized, then it also, the way that we look at politicians tends to be very preemptive, meaning that they're either these amazing heroes and great people with impeccable morals, or they're complete garbage. But usually we don't give them this kind of multidimensionality, I guess. Except that I guess propositionality is a little more, because you when you look at someone propositionally, you actually see them as having all these traits at the same time. Whereas when you preempt someone, you reduce them to just one. So let me give you examples of preemptive constraint. So this is Truman Capote, and these are two of his quotes. He had a lot of these very snappy quotes. So one is, all literature is gossip. So that means that he reduces literally all of literature to just gossip and nothing else. That's preemptive. Another example is this is his review of The Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Suzanne, and he said, that's not writing, that's typing. And what's implied is that this is just typing and nothing else. So that's preemptive. It's when you reduce all of the potential of an event or a person or yourself, just one thing and nothing else. So what does this mean for us? Preemptive constraint, like I said, reduces our understanding to just one dimension, to just one construct, specifically to one pole of one construct. So something is just bad and nothing else. Propositional constraint allows us to look at things from several perspectives at once and gives us a fuller picture. Preemptive constraint introduces a lot of clarity into our world. So the way that I described preemptive constraint doesn't make it sound like it's good, but according to Kelly and Constructivism, impermeable, permeable, preemptive, propositional, and everything else that he introduces, none of it is good or bad. It's all about whether it works when you use it. So sometimes when we need a lot of clarity in the world, we do that. We reduce our world to just one thing. In interpersonal relations, and when we look at ourselves and we reduce our entire personality to just one thing, that's often not a good thing. On the other hand, there are situations when it's good. Let's say you're rescuing people from a burning building. You're very likely to, in that moment, preempt yourself as just being this brave person who has to go in there. And that's good, because you don't want to go inside the burning building and then think, yes, I am a brave person, but at the same time, I'm also kind of scared. And I also have to think about, I don't know, my parents, and so on and so on. That would really not make you very effective. So if you need instant clarity, our impulse is very often to be preemptive. That the way perfectionism gets us to preempt things is to say we're just bad and nothing else. Like we suck. That's the general principle through which perfectionists preempt things. So prejudice, stereotypes, and labeling people is also an example of preemptive, or something similar to this called constellatory, but preemptive anyway, constraint. So when in perfectionism, we see impermeability and we see preemption. That means that you reduce yourself to good or bad, or like good enough, not good enough, depending on how you tend to phrase it. So you reduce yourself to just that. And because when what you reduce yourself to is very impermeable, you end up being never good enough. Here's how that can look like. Again, these are examples. I have permission to use all these examples, just to be clear. If I can't have smooth skin, I might as well not exist. This is clear preemption. One little thing goes wrong, and I feel like a complete and utter failure. One little thing goes wrong, that's impermeable, and I feel like a complete and utter failure, that's preemptive, because you feel like a failure and nothing else. I'm not going to waste my time talking about emotions. They're irrational, chemical, period. So emotions are irrational and nothing else. Whenever we encounter preemption, my question as a therapist, and your question if you want to understand yourself as well, is why is it that I need to preempt this? It's like, why is it that I have to exclude every other possibility? In therapy, this is how we usually discover resistance. So let's look at the last one. BFRBs are really just habits. Let's not pretend like there's anything else there. Help me unlearn them, and that's it. meaning please don't ask me about my emotions. This is just a habit, just a behavior that repeats itself. Let's just ignore all of my psychology and put it aside. And when you look at body-focused repetitive behaviors as just habits and nothing else, what you really do is that you exclude the possibility of them having any deeper or other meaning. And sometimes that tells us that this is exactly what we should be including. And then the third very important concept to understand how perfectionism works is hostility. Kelly wrote this paper, which again, I believe you can find online. It's called Hostility, if I'm not mistaken, where he introduces the concept of hostility by using the metaphor of the bed of Procrustes. So Procrustes was the son of Poseidon. And in Kelly's text, he basically introduces Procrustes as this person who owns, let's say, an Airbnb, and he rents it. And he wants to be the perfect host because, there's no other type except for the perfect host. And so he has guests that come and he gives them a bed to sleep on. And then when they go to sleep after dinner, he kind of takes a peek to see if they're having their perfect time, because that's the only way that he can be a perfect host. And then what happens sometimes is that he will see that someone is, let's say, taller than the bed he has. And he will see that this person's legs will kind of be dangling off of beds, which happens to me more often than I'd like. And that really upsets Procrustes, because if this bed is not 100% perfectly comfortable, that makes him less of a perfect host. And really, of all the things, he must be the perfect host. So how does he resolve this thing? He cannot go out to get another bed because it's middle of the night. Let's say all the other beds are busy and there's this bed and this person's legs. So naturally, he takes, I don't know, like a sword or a knife and cuts that person's legs off. Because if you cut all the legs that's kind of dangling off the bed, the person then fits in the bed perfectly. And if the person, or what remains of the person, fits in that bed perfectly, that means that Procrustes is the perfect host. Problem solved. I guess problem solved after he throws away the amputated legs. But this is the idea of hostility, that when reality doesn't fit into our ideas about reality, instead of changing our ideas, what we do is we try to force reality to fit into our ideas about it. So perfectionists, and also in general, people who struggle with body-focused repetitive behaviors, even if they're not perfectionists, they often employ the same mechanism. Even though there is ample evidence to show that our assumptions about the world are incorrect. Let's say a perfectionist starts to realize that perfection is impossible. Instead of changing perfectionism, what they do is they try to twist and turn the evidence to fit into their perfectionist ideas. Or eventually, after many, many attempts to distort and force evidence, they disregard it altogether. So if you look at hostility in the way that we normally see it as a kind of aggression, this is really the same thing. Someone says no to something, you bully them into saying yes. So, except that it's a kind of more raw application. What Kelly suggests here is that hostility is a very subtle mechanism, one that allows us to basically falsify reality to fit, with our ideas about reality. So this is a very powerful and a potent mechanism, and it's usually very difficult to discover. And the key to discovering it is to focus on our emotional reactions, because the way that hostility works is that rationally, it is extremely hard, almost impossible to detect, because our minds have this way of just polishing out and kind of neglecting, reinterpreting, and putting aside the evidence that we cannot deal with otherwise. So this is the third component that I think is incredibly important to mention. Here are some examples of hostility and how it works in perfectionism, specifically, of course, for skin picking. I know I'm not improving my face and I'm not making my skin any smoother. I know, and I keep doing it, I can't stop. So this is a moment where a person has the insight, but this hypothesis, this idea, this construct is so strong that it basically does the person, instead of person using the construct. Like that's how strong hostility can be. So you see that there's no evidence, but in that moment, when you approach the mirror to pick, you find a way to justify it to yourself. Like, I will just do this one, or I will be very careful not to do any damage, or you convince yourself that what you're picking is indeed a pimple that's just ready to pick, as if there is such a thing, right? So we employ all these kinds of logical maneuvers to justify what we want to do. Here's another one. Of course, things can't be perfect, duh, but they can be better, and I should be able to do better. You see that you cannot do better, but yet you keep insisting that, there must be. So you nominally say, well, it doesn't have to be perfect, just very close to that. And then you keep doing it. And this is also kind of twisting words around to continue using the same perfectionist standards. And another one. I'm terrified that people will figure out why I cover my face with so much makeup. No one has ever said anything, and no one seems to notice, but I'm still terrified. And this is also something, I'm not this particular example, but variation on a theme that I see very frequently. That people will say, well, if I have to pick, because if someone sees that I have a pimple, it's so gross that they will be completely grossed out. And then, they'll never speak to me again. They will think I'm a horrible person and so on. So I asked, has anyone ever been grossed out by you? And then they say, well, no, they haven't. But, that's because I remove all the pimples. And then I say, so you've never been in front of another person with a pimple? And then they say, well, of course I have. And I said, well, were they grossed out? And then the client says, well, no, they weren't. And I was like, and then I say, well, you're still terrified and you still pick. And they say, well, yes, because someone one day might be. So there's a lot of empirical evidence in this specific person's case that no one is grossed out. And in fact, people, even if they do notice, they simply don't care because it's a pimple. But in order to justify continuing to pick and continuing to insist on having the perfect skin, the person will give their fear this validity that rises above all the empirical evidence. And then they say, yes, but just because no one ever noticed doesn't mean that no one ever will. So they will kind of reframe the evidence that they have so that they can keep doing what they're doing. Okay, so hopefully by now you have a good idea about the processes that take place, I would say in the mind of a perfectionist, but it makes it sound like there's this specific person I'm referring to. So how do we change it, you ask? So from impermeable and preemptive, we have to go in the opposite direction, albeit slightly, which is to use these constructs in a more permeable and a more propositional way. So from reducing our world, we need to look at it in a more complex way. And from having such a list of criteria, we need to learn how to include things that fit, let's say, 8 out of 11 and not only 11 out of 11. And when it comes to hostility, we need to let our guard down and allow ourselves to be changed. Because what hostility really does is that it's really just an effort not to change, right? It's an effort to keep our constructs the way they were, even if they don't work. So how do we do that? Let's see. So a second, I'm looking at my clock to see how much I'm running over time. So I'm going to give you essentially 3 different categories of techniques here. I have to say they all require time. There are no quick fixes and life hacks for perfectionism. If you've listened to me before, you know that I detest life hacks and such. I don't think there are any shortcuts when it comes to our psychological life, especially for things that have been present for years and years and years. So these 3 different types of techniques are techniques that help you introduce context. Because when you reduce the world to just one thing, so when you go from propositional to preemptive, you lose context essentially. And this is extremely important. To understand what our agency is, this is what these techniques do, and to understand what the limits of our agency are. Because even though we are quite powerful and we can control a lot of things, we can't control everything and we can't do everything. And our expectations have to be formed having this in mind. Otherwise, we really kind of just anticipate failure with the way that we set up the game. So essentially, this comes down to learning how to use context in decision-making processes and how to set expectations that take these limitations into account. Assessing evidence, so different techniques that help you establish what the facts are, and then ways to ask the right questions. And then self-relationship techniques, which help you cultivate a different relationship to yourself. And I will tell you exactly how that works based on Kelly's theory. So let's first consider making realistic goals. This is very easy to remember. So I mean, it's a convenient and a quick technique. So if you can remember, SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timed. Unless your goals satisfy all 5 of these, they're not good. Perfectionist goals almost never do. They're usually very highly specific, but they're usually not measurable. And it's very important for perfectionism not to have measurable goals, because if your goals are measurable, then you can immediately see what's logical and reasonable to expect and what isn't. And also, it's very difficult if you have a measurable goal, it's very difficult to twist and turn things in your head so that you end up being not good enough. So goals have to be measurable. They have to be attainable. So to repeat, they have to be attainable. Attainable means that in the practical circumstances in your life, they have to be achievable. This means that you cannot say, most people can do this, therefore I should be able to do this. This is not attainable. I mean, it might be, but it is not by default. So attainable doesn't mean doesn't have anything to do with what other people can do. Other people are completely unimportant when it comes to what's attainable. What's attainable means, in the specific circumstances of your life, what is it that you can do? So you have to take a look at what you can control, what you cannot control, what you can predict, what might happen that you cannot predict. And then and how, let's say, how rested you are, how relaxed you are, and so on. That's attainable when you factor in all this. And then goals have to be relevant. Perfectionism often gets us to fail at the most, how can I put it? We fail at stupid things. Just pardon me being blunt, but that's just how it is. So a lot of the times when we feel horrible for not having done something well enough or fast enough and so on, these things are not even relevant for us. Like, they don't give us anything. So this is very important. Goals have to be relevant. If you're going to judge your self-worth based on something, it better be a core important thing, like something very, very high up your list of values. And of course, goals have to be timed. And being timed is also related to how attainable they are. What's attainable in 2 years is often not attainable in, obviously, 2 months. There's an example that I can give you. I mentioned the client that I was responding to, and the client that said, well, I only did my competing responses 9 out of 10 times efficiently. This is a person who has been picking for, if I'm not mistaken, around 15 years. And they never sought treatment before because they were ashamed and their circumstances were that they couldn't. And then they've been trying out techniques for a few days, and 9 out of 10 times is not fast enough. I mean, talk about unattainable. So when we talk about timed, it has to be in the context of what's attainable for you specifically. So when you set realistic goals, those are not goals that get you to compare yourself to other people. They're goals that are supposed to be, as Brené Brown says, self-focused. So it's about what's attainable for you. If you remember in the beginning, when I was mentioning Karen Horney and her book about her essay about the tyranny of should, she said that essentially that perfectionists have this double set of standards. There's what you can expect from other people, and then there's what you can expect from yourself. Because perfectionists feel entitled to kind of live their fantasy fully, they have to up the standards for themselves. That means that if someone makes a mistake, a friend, a colleague, a coworker, whatever, you're very likely to forgive them, or even not to see it as a mistake at all, but to see it as, for example, well, that's just who they are, right? I hope that makes sense. Whereas if you do the same thing, it's basically how dare you be human and make a mistake. So perfectionism almost always carries a set of double standards for itself. One set are these impossible high standards that no one can actually ever achieve. And then another, a more realistic set of standards for other people. So when I was talking about setting smart goals, it's not that you have to invent something that you don't have in your mind. You already have these attainable, smart goal-setting skills, but you just direct them at other people. So make an effort in your everyday life to put this difference into words and to articulate these points where you give others more freedom than you give yourself. Call yourself out in this as well. Just notice how they work in your everyday life. And then challenge the unfair status quo. The way that you do this is not that you kind of slap yourself and fight with yourself. That doesn't really work. One is when you notice that you're applying these incredibly high standards on yourself, one thing to do is to ask yourself why. So if you're doing something, there's always a reason. People are not really, random machines. So there's always a reason for something that you do. You just ask yourself, why is it that I deserve, or rather, why is it that I don't deserve these normal standards? So what is it about me that I have to have these high standards? And then make your mind give you a good argument for it. And then the second of all is when you notice that you're using these incredibly high standards for yourself, try to spell out the consequences. What will happen? How will things unfold? How will you feel? And then compare and contrast with the realistic standards that you have for other people. And then see what the difference is. Then there's also another practical approach you can take, which is to make a conscious effort to judge yourself as if you were someone else. I recently had clients who applied this kind of spontaneously, and I was really very happy. But think of yourself like if you're going to, I don't know, go to write a report for work. Think of yourself as if you were just any other colleague writing that report, and write it that way. So a good part of change, and specifically when we talk about change in CBT and also in constructivism, is that change really comes from empirical experience. There's no theorizing your way to change. There's like thinking and analyzing has its purpose, but ultimately you have to try and do things differently. So consciously decide what are the standards that you can use when you judge yourself as if you were someone else, and then make an experiment and see what happens. There's another way. We described perfectionism in the beginning as the tyranny of shoulds. So rebel against it with an appropriate painting. Make a conscious effort to eliminate shoulds from your self-talk, or even from the way you talk in general. This can be quite helpful. So no more shoulds for tomorrow. Or try to give yourself 24 hours where there will be no shoulds in the way that you talk. And so you might ask, how is it that I should be talking if I cannot use any shoulds? Try to replace shoulds with something that Kelly would call an invitational mood, or an invitational way of speaking. That means that instead of, I should be able to work 15 hours today, try to see it as, I have so much work that I may need to work more than 8 hours, for example, because I should be able to work for whatever, I said, well, 14 hours, is not the same thing as I may need to work more. If you may need to work more, but you just so happen to be tired, that's not the end of the world. But if you should, then it is the end of the world. So try to make a conscious effort to formulate your self-talk and also the way that you talk to other people by using, let's say, more potential or this kind of more invitational way of speaking. Let's see what happens if I try to do this. I hope that makes sense. So you can do an experiment. This might be, you need to think about how to go about doing this experiment. I wouldn't necessarily use what I propose here in the same way. So spend a certain amount of time doing the opposite of what your shoulds are telling you. One way to rebel against someone is not just to question the authority and curb it in these subtle ways like changing your self-talk. Sometimes you need to just go head on and create a whole revolution. So one way to do that is that if your shoulds are saying, you have to be productive and there's no way around that, well, one thing that you can do is to say, well, productive, you mean productive? Me? I don't think so. And then spend a whole day or an hour or half an hour, whatever is reasonable for you at this time, and then do the exact opposite. So if, I don't know, I said productive, so the exact opposite might be to waste time. Then figure out what will be a waste of time for you and do just that. And then when you finish like an hour or half an hour or the whole weekend of doing the opposite of productive, examine what happened, examine what the consequences were, examine how you felt, but make sure to be propositional and permeable. Remember, being propositional means that even though you might be tempted to say, well, I was horribly anxious the whole time, that certainly is a valid way to see that experience. Kind of make an effort to see the experience in all its complexity. So, for example, I recently had a client who wanted to start a mindfulness practice. And then they said how much I should do. I said 20 minutes a day. They said, oh my God, 20 minutes, I can't do 20 minutes. That's not good. So we eventually kind of bargained and got down to 10 minutes. And one of the things that the client shared with me once they had a few days of meditation under their belt, they said, oh my God, did you ever notice how long 10 minutes is? Like there's so much stuff that you can do. And then I said, what do you mean? And then the client said, well, my mind was wandering the whole time. And I thought about this, that, remembered these things from my childhood, made a shopping list. I thought about a TV show that I'm watching. And she said something like, my God, like 10 minutes is such a long time. So that's one way that you can frame 10 minutes in a way that you kind of appreciate it and develop a kind of gratitude towards it instead of saying, well, I wasted 10 minutes. So just make sure to open yourself up to the experience and allow yourself to see it in more than just the preemptive black and white terms. That's one thing. There's also a more creative approach from constructivism and from narrative therapy. So you have them in both types of therapy, and everyone says they're theirs, so it doesn't matter if anyone. So if we're talking about rebelling against the tyranny of the shoulds, it really helps to kind of see who is it that you're rebelling against. Obviously, I mean, you're rebelling against a part of yourself. This part usually doesn't really have a shape, a name. It's kind of vague and diffuse. That means that bad thoughts can pop up anywhere and anytime, and they always take us by surprise. So in order to make this more predictable, what we usually do in therapy, although this is not something that's very easily done in writing in SkinPick, but this is if you have a journal, if you like to daydream, if you have a therapist one-to-one, then this is something that you can actually use, is to make an effort to try to visualize, like, who is this lord of the shoulds that's bothering you all the time. I was thinking, because I started the webinar with Dostoevsky, I thought maybe I should put like Tsar Nicholas or someone who's overthrown in a revolution. But then I thought, no, I think the Let Them Eat Cake lady would be a much better suited for the times that we live in. But the point is like, you don't have to imagine your inner tyrant as Marie Antoinette, but whatever works for you, make an effort to visualize who this person is. But don't stop at these kinds of like, don't stop by saying, well, it's a man, or it's an older man, or it's a man like my father, whatever. Just don't stop there. Make an effort to really visualize them. The person that's giving you these shoes, like, what do they look like? What color eyes do they have? How do they dress? How do they move? How do they walk? How do they talk? All these tiny little details. Like, just, if you like to write, invent a whole personality for them. Because the more you do, the more light you shed on this part of you that's very hard to put into words. When you do that, you can start developing dialogue with them. Um, there is a very good article that describes this technique. It's called the community of selves. And I don't know why, but I cannot remember the author, even though he's quite a famous constructivist. I apologize, but it's called the community of selves. I think this is also something that you can find online at this point. So I said entering into dialogue with this person. There are several ways in which you can do that. You can actually get to know them, see what purpose they serve, what's their job, why are they a part of you? Because, like I said, there's not a single part of our psyche that's random and meaningless. So through developing imaginary dialogues with these people, you can actually try to figure out why is it that they're there. Like, if you think about it, like, you have this tyrannical part of yourself that's giving you all these commands and things that you absolutely must do. And why would they be there in the first place? So I have one example from a client of mine who had this part. Shouldn't call it a tyrant, but it had a name which I'm not going to disclose. It was a very creative and a nice name. Anyway, so we did this technique for a while, and then through one of these conversations, those were kind of face-to-face sessions before COVID, when that was possible. And the client sort of came up with this theory that if she didn't have this part of her that was so strict and so unforgiving, that she might never become the smart and educated person that she is. And then the more we talked about this, we realized that this is obviously a reflection of her family's kind of views on discipline and education and so on. But then she came to this conclusion that a lot of the things that she knows and learns and is interested in, it's not because there's this part of her that's screaming at her that she's not good enough. But in fact, it's because she's genuinely interested in some of this stuff. And then starting from there, she sort of started leaning on this healthier part of her and started looking for motivation in these sort of authentic interests and this authentic excitement that she would get when she would learn something new, instead of having this, tyrant saying, you're not good enough if you don't do this, you have to do that, and so on. Before you start engaging in these, let's say, deeper dialogues with this part of you, the best way to start working with them is, once you notice that they're coming, so when you notice the thoughts and the emotions, is just to tell them something like, well, thank you for sharing. So if you're in the SkinPick program, you know that something similar to this is already a technique in the program, but it is very useful. When you thank that part for sharing their thoughts, you're kind of validating them. You're giving them space to unload all their negativity and all their demands. But by saying thank you for sharing, you're also saying, well, that was really lovely, but not for me. So you're opening up some space for you to find what works for you in the moment. By thanking that part of yourself, you're basically sending it away. You're letting go. Kind of like in meditation, when you have a thought and then you basically label it as a thought and let it go away. So this would be one approach. In terms of redefining the way that you relate to yourself and your experiences, I will talk about two sets of techniques. One is forgiveness, and then the second one is self-compassion. So forgiveness is an active and conscious acceptance of our flaws and failures, obviously, followed by letting go and moving on. So what does this mean? So forgiveness means that you realize that you have done something that has fallen short of your impossible standards. You see it clearly, you accept it. And when I say forgive yourself, that means that you learn to let it go and move on. Forgiveness is also a good opportunity to learn. If you failed, that can mean two things. One, success was not an option because of the way that the game is set up. Or two, you actually did something wrong. If you're stuck in this perfectionist mindset, you're very likely to go on this kind of down this rabbit hole of self-judgment and self-loathing, to call yourself names, to make yourself feel even worse as if failure itself isn't unpleasant and painful. But if you approach your experience with this attitude of forgiveness, then you can see very clearly and accept what has happened and take that moment to actually learn. Letting go refers to letting go of guilt and difficult emotions because what's done is done, you can't fix it, but you can examine what went wrong. So forgiveness opens up a space for that. It allows you to see whether or not you actually did something wrong in terms of making a wrong calculation or not anticipating something correctly. And then you can learn and try to do better next time. Or you can turn your attention to the criteria that you judge yourself by and examine them. But forgiveness creates a kind of safe space for you to be able to do this. You can cultivate forgiveness formally and informally, like any mindfulness-based skill. There are actual phrases that you can repeat in meditation to sort of slowly cultivate forgiveness. A lot of apps offer these guided forgiveness meditations. Forgiveness is a way to produce permeability. So what we talked about impermeable constraint in the beginning, well, forgiveness is a way to kind of dissipate that and open up a little more space. That means that if there was only one way to do something and that was acceptable, by cultivating forgiveness, you create several versions that might be acceptable. It helps you deal with anger and frustration that also very often accompany perfectionism. Forgiveness kind of directly attacks those. One thing that you can do so if you want formal practice, you can find guided meditations, or if you like, you can email me and I can send you some. I think I have one or two in MP3. But informally, so when you catch yourself failing, which for a perfectionist isn't very hard, you can ask yourself, like you can find a simple definition that works for you, but what I like is, would I rather be angry or free now? Like if I choose to cling on to this failure, I'm just going to be frustrated. If I choose to forgive myself, I'll be free. So choose. And when you put yourself in the moment, in front of a choice like that, just pay attention and see how you behave. Another thing is self-compassion. So the shortest way that I can define self-compassion is wanting to reduce suffering. Well, your own suffering in case of self-compassion. In practical aspects, self-compassion is actually self-kindness. So when you cultivate self-compassion, you're actually kind of growing this intention inside of you to reduce your own suffering once you notice it. That means that over time, self-compassion is the direct antidote to perfectionism. It's the most direct way to attack it. Why? Because when you fail to do something, and every perfectionist fails at least once a day at something, once self-compassion flows in, it eliminates the judgments and it eliminates the pain because it redirects you to constructive ways to actually make your pain lesser, make yourself feel better, to heal. There's an example in Sharon Salzberg's book, Loving Kindness, which I cannot recommend strongly enough if you're interested in that type of mindfulness. I think it's in that book. She talks about this retreat that she went on where she was supposed to cultivate loving kindness and self-compassion the whole time. And she used to be very strict and very hard on herself. And so she was on the retreat, meditating all day, every day, repeating all these phrases, but she wouldn't feel really anything. And she didn't think that the meditation is doing anything for her. And something happened. I believe one of her friends was either got sick or died at one of these, and she had to leave the retreat. And anyway, while she was kind of getting ready to go, she broke one of her mugs or something that she really cherished. And as that mug fell to the ground and broke, she looked at it, and to her own surprise, her default reaction wasn't, something judgmental like, how dare you, you're not thinking, and so on. Her reaction was, Sharon, you're such a klutz, but I love you. And that's a genuinely kind and compassionate response. It didn't diminish what she did, uh, but it also kind of acknowledged her pain and said, well, yeah, you did it, but stuff happens. That's a nice example of both self-compassion and forgiveness. And that's something that comes obviously with sustained practice. But this is why it's an antidote to perfectionism, because you do something wrong and your instinct is not to say, well, you failed to live up to this impossible standard. Your instinct is to say, yeah, you screwed up, but you're fine, you're good. Self-compassion can also be cultivated formally and informally. Formal practice is about sort of sitting every day and meditating and cultivating self-compassion by either using visualization or phrases, or there are many different ways you can do that formally. And informal practice would be to kind of consciously try to be kinder and nicer to yourself in everyday life. Even though we call it informal practice for both forgiveness and this, the best thing to do is to actually decide how you will do that and to make a plan for yourself, to introduce some structure, to make sure that you adhere to it. Both forgiveness and self-compassion are good tools to start a more fundamental process of change. So not just how you apply the constructs, but also what the constructs are. They provide insight and allow us to start creating new narratives about who we are as people. So it's not that you will learn how to be happy with more imperfection. You will actually shift the whole story. It's not going to be about, I don't know, if you're good enough or not good enough. It's going to be about whether you feel fulfilled or not, and so on. So, however you want to structure your new narrative is obviously up to you. So this is the end of our main part, and it was